Right, so CQC registration and interview, is yours correct and how to fix it? So I'm going to go through, this webinar has come about because, to be honest, there's a lot of people out there that their CQC registration just isn't correct. And we'll look at those scenarios, and you may surprisingly find out that you're running an unregistered service. But we'll look at all the different scenarios around that. But there's a lot of people out there. Also, I have it on quite good authority that the CQC have now gone. Well, we know the CQC are going self-funding because they've been doing a lot of analysis on the fees that they charge and everything like that. But one of the other things that I hear is that they now have a team in their head office that has been specifically created to locate people who are knowingly have incorrect registrations or are running unregistered services, and they're going to start trying to sort of find people, get them to register, and potentially fine them. So, as is with any organisation when it goes self-funding, the CQC, the only routes that they're going to have for income is going to be registration fees, annual fees, or fines. So what we might find is the CQC are going to start looking at this a lot more. Well, I've been told that they are, but it's kind of unofficial. So I thought it would be a good time because we get a lot of questions about this as well on the helpline. So, going through this. So when you register with the CQC, there's this whole thing of providers or locations. So what is a provider and what is a location? So you register providers with the CQC and then you register locations. But people get very, very confused about what these things are. The bottom line is a provider, I'm just reading off the slide, but a provider is providers are the businesses approved to run healthcare services by the CQC. And it's the businesses, not the people. And this is really, really important to remember, is you register the business, right? So they're either sole traders, and the reason I put not people after that is because if you're a sole trader, you're not registering yourself. You are registering the bit of you that is a business, if that makes sense. So if I'm Alex O'Neill, I'm a sole trader, and I set up Alex O'Neill Dentistry, and I register that business with the CQC, I'm not registering, they're not approving me. They do because of the interview side of it. They approve me to run it, but that's a separate thing. I am registering my business, my sole trader business. It's the thing that has to, do the tax return, pay the business rates, things like that. So going back to what I was saying, providers are the businesses. So it's either a sole trader, but it's not really yourself you're registering the business. Partnerships. Now, but this is true partnerships. True partnerships are a partnership where all partners are jointly and severally liable for all debts. They are a business within themselves. Now what that means, well, there's very, very few true partnerships in dentistry. Most of your practices where you have partners, they are expense sharers. Now that means that legally they're not a true partnership. Now what that actually means, or what that's about, is the way they defined a true partnership is all partners are jointly and severally liable for all debts, liabilities, etc. What that practically means in a dental practice is with expense, well, if you're a true partnership, if someone tries to sue you, you're all jointly liable as a business. If a patient owes you money, they owe the practice money and not an individual dentist. And this is generally what it boils down to in dentistry. In dentistry, most of our partnerships are expense sharers in that the debts and the income belong, for a particular patient list, as it were, belong to that dentist. So when you're dealing with partnerships, and a partnership in dentistry, and it's also about who's responsible. So if something goes wrong with a patient and they try to sue someone, are they suing the company? Are they suing the dentist? In dentistry, with the expense sharing partnerships, every individual partner, legally speaking, is a legal entity, a business within their own right. So when you have a partnership, if you have an expense sharing partnership, like some practices I know, where you have 6 partners, one of them's actually a limited company, or runs a limited company, and that's how he does his dentistry. or 3 of them are, one of them is a sole trader, every single business entity has to register with the CQC. So there might be quite a few of you on this right now where you are in a partnership and you're in an expense sharing partnership, and what's happened is you've registered as a true partnership, which means your registration with the CQC is currently incorrect. Or you've just registered one of the partners, you've registered one of the limited companies or one of the sole traders, and essentially you're running one registered service, and if you have 3 other partners, you're actually running 3 unregistered services. We find this quite often, that partnerships have actually misunderstood. So if you're in a partnership, it's probably quite important to check your registration. Organisations, quite simply, in dentistry, it's pretty much limited companies. If you're a limited company, then that limited company needs to be registered. So I've put that bullet point down there, it says it again, providers are not people. If we can stop thinking of providers as being people, even if you're a sole trader, it is not you that is registered, it is your business. Right, so locations, very, very simply, providers are approved by the CQC to carry out regulated services, regulated activities, which we'll get to in a second. That's what you're applying for. Locations are the practices where you carry them out. Straightforward, right? Well, they're not necessarily just practices. It can be your head office if you're running a domiciliary service or something like that. But locations are the places where regulated activities are either carried out or managed. Cool, so I'll move on from that one. So what are the regulated activities? I am not going to go into this into great detail. The 3 of them are at the bottom there. Those are the 3 that all dental services pretty much need to register for. If you've registered for services for everyone, you probably didn't need to, but it's not really a problem. But those are the 3 things. So if you're filling out a CQC application form as a dental practice and it's saying what regulated activities are you applying for, those are the 3 boxes you need to tick. Diagnostic and screening procedures, treatment of disease, disorder and injury, or surgical procedures. And if you're doing any of those and operating an unregistered service, you are liable to be prosecuted and you're liable for a fine. Now, so let's look at some common scenarios that we come across. So the top one, I've seen this so many times, a registered sole trader. So someone is a sole trader, they've registered their practice with the CQC as a sole trader, and then they've incorporated for tax reasons. So if you are a sole trader, your business has been registered with the CQC, or that is your business, it's going through your accounts, that's how you're paying your staff, that's how you're doing your taxes. And I've now decided to incorporate for tax reasons. What has actually happened legally on a business level is my sole trader business has ceased and desisted trading, has technically transferred the ownership of the practice to a brand new business, a brand new limited company that hasn't been approved by the CQC. You are now operating an unregistered service for the CQC. You do not have permission to treat patients in your limited company. Now, what quite a lot of people say is, but I'm approved, I've been approved by the CQC. Like, they're fine with me. But it's not, because it was your sole trader business that was registered, and that sole trader business no longer exists, is not carrying out business. So basically, in that thing, you need to deregister your sole trader business, and you have to register a brand new business. It's the same process as if your practice has been bought out, which technically, legally, it probably has, because your limited company has now taken over the goodwill of your business. I've seen some people actually sell their business to a former limited company and actually sell their business to the limited company. So that's that one. The next one is you've set up because the NHS won't allow you, you've registered your NHS business, your sole trader business, where as a sole trader, you're holding your GDS contract with, between you and the NHS, and you've registered that sole trader business with the NHS. Your accountant has now advised you, actually, if you have a limited company, then you're actually probably going to pay less tax. What we've done is generally that the NHS won't let you transfer, or it's very difficult to transfer a GDS contract to a limited company. So what people do is they set up a separate limited company, and all the private business goes through that. Because now our private patients are not covered by our CQC registration. because they're not seen by the sole trader business. They are seen by the private business. You are now operating an unlicensed, unregistered, essentially dental practice, and your patients are at risk. Officially, not actually, probably, because it's probably the same. So they need to register that. The third one, an expense sharing partnership, only has one of the partners registered, or is registered as a true partnership. I won't go into that one because that's what I was talking about on the first slide. And the bottom one, a hospital specialist rents a room for 1 day a week from an existing provider to see his privately referred patients. Essentially, if they're not an associate, so firstly, if they are not an associate, they are running their own business. Their patients aren't covered by your CQC registration. So if they're renting a room from you, the fact that you are a registered provider is completely and utterly irrelevant. Now, there are a lot of practices out there, I think, where this could be a problem. The difference is that and it all comes down to whether or not he already has an existing registration. But if he's a 5 day a week, 4 day a week fully NHS, working in the NHS, and he just has 1 day a week where he wants to make a bit of extra money privately, he probably needs to register as a provider. Right, so moving on from this. I mean, the important thing here is, right, so we spoke before, if you're running an unregistered service, the CQC don't generally like to throw the book at people, but if they chose to throw the book at you, this is what could happen. Because it's interesting, and I keep talking about this just generally when in webinars, on the phone to some of you, compliance is kind of a weird word, right? I'd like people to stop thinking about being behind. You're either compliant or you're not complying. And if you're not complying, it could mean you're breaking laws. And that, say in this scenario, you've set up a separate company to do your private work and you haven't registered that with the CQC, you're breaking laws. That's the bottom line, is that you're breaching, we call it breaching a regulation, but the bottom line is it's breaking a law, and in that law it says you can be fined up to 50 grand. And it's whether or not are the CQC going to start really looking at this year, I don't know. Generally they don't make a big deal out of it, but it looks, as I said earlier, it looks like they might do this year. But just to give this is the worst case scenario of what could happen. So moving on, when you register things, we have these things of registered persons, right? So a registered person is someone who is legally responsible for managing the service regulated activities on a daily basis, and they have to be interviewed and approved for fitness. So that's where we get the fit person interview, which sole traders have a fit person interview, partners in true partnerships get a fit person interview, and registered managers get fit person interviews. These are your legally responsible people. So these are the people that have to be interviewed during registration. So I've said that there. Sole traders, partners in true partnerships, registered managers in limited companies and partnerships. You have to register a manager. Now the reason for that is in dentistry and in a small practice, quite often you're seen as, in a small practice where you've incorporated for tax reasons or something like that, legally speaking, you are the same as my dentist. You are the same business entity. You are a limited company. So the same rules have to apply to you in that they have to assume that you may have many, many, many practices, right? So it's the same legal framework. So the way that works is that you have to have a registered manager in each of those practices. So a sole trader will probably just have one practice, right? So they are the manager, they are the registered person as well. When you've got a giant organization like a limited company, the rules are that every location has to have someone responsible for making sure that that location stays compliant, and that person is called the registered manager. So what's a nominated individual then? So a nominated individual is just merely the spokesperson, the contact point for the CQC. So because if there's a problem, you've got to say, if there's a problem in compliance in one of my dentist's 300 practices and they want to talk to the management about it, they need a contact point at head office in order to be able to give them letters and serve them notices, to serve the company notices, but in order to have that communication with them. That is the nominated individual. So the nominated individual practices need to make sure that they have DBS checks that are up to date when they are appointed to nominated individual. When you put it on your application form, this person's your nominated individual. However, the one thing that they're not being assessed for fitness because they're not responsible for managing the service. In a small practice, so as I said, the same rules apply to you as a small limited company as apply to my dentist. So in a small practice where you've got one practice, the nominated individual and the registered manager, they will allow to be the same person, because practically it doesn't really matter because you've got one practice or two practices. It's not going to get lost, right? When you're dealing with 300 practices, the nominated individual is, generally speaking, the clinical director or someone like that just slipping off it, is on the board of directors. So moving on from registered persons. So I hope that all made sense. Fitness. So registered people are assessed for fitness during an interview. Now, I'm going to talk about preparing for the interview later, but I just wanted to sort of run through this. This is from the CQC's guidance on how you meet the fundamental standards, which I'll talk about later as well. But you can see on here, essentially, these are the summary of the regulation, is that they only want the regulated activities to be managed by people who are of good character. So that's DBS checks and things like that, and references. Able to perform tasks intrinsic to the role, they can do that job. Has the necessary qualifications, competence, skills and experience to manage the regulated activity. That's going to be super important when we talk about the interview. And has supplied documents that confirm their suitability, and I'll talk about what those documents are. But if you look above that section to the actual snippet from the Health and Social Care Act, this is all in law, right? So this is actually, you can read, that is the law. You know, the CQC aren't allowed to approve a registered manager if they don't have the necessary qualifications, competence. And if you go down to the bottom, sorry, I'm pointing at the screen, which you can't see. And if you look at the bottom one, number 3, it says, in assessing an individual's character, the matters must include that are listed in Part 2 of Schedule 4. That's about bankruptcy and things like that. And then, and 2D there says the information relating to themselves as specified in Schedule 3. And Schedule 3 of the Health and Social Care Act is the bit that says you have to have a DBS check, you have to have a CV with any gaps in employment explained, things like that. So this is the rules that the CQC are assessing you against. And they're also the rules that you assess nominated individuals against, and generally speaking, anybody you employ. So we'll come back to this document later because it's crucial for preparing for the interview. Right, so timeframes. Timeframes are really, really important for either. This is either fixing a registration or doing a brand new registration. The first thing that you have to do is have DBS checks for nominated individuals or people that you're registering as registered persons. Those DBS checks have to be countersigned by the CQC, so they have to go through the CQC process, which is cqc.disclosures is the website, and the DBS checks take up to 8 weeks, and you can't actually do your application or fix your registration unless you've got those DBS checks that are no older than 12 months. So they have to be no older than 12 months, and that can take up to 8 weeks. So at the point you realise you need to do a registration or fix a registration, you've actually got an 8-week start time. So that's really, really important. Once you've got, you cannot do the application until you've got the DBS checks, and then you submit your application. You fill out the application forms. I'll talk about some of the bits on the application forms, but the one thing I couldn't do on this webinar, unfortunately, is actually go through the whole application form with you and all the documents, because that would have just been impossible. But you fill out your application, you submit your application. In week 1, it is Oliver, I'll come back to that question at the end of this slide. So week 1, you submit your application. It's then validated. That's just a team at CQC that makes sure that you've made no mistakes. If you had made mistakes, they will throw it back at you and ask you to resubmit it. Once they're happy with it, that's assigned in week 2 to a regional team and a registration inspector, who then, in between weeks 3 and 8, generally will assess the information that you've been given, have a look at you online, might request information on you, and will decide on risk. So depending on the scenario that you're in, which we'll talk about later, they're then going to look at what interviews do we need to do? Do we need to do a site inspection? And there are rules around that, which I'll discuss a bit later. Week 8 to 10 is generally where they do, week 8 to 10 is generally where they do interviews and a visit. So they'll come and do their interviews and their visits. Then around week 10 to 12 is when you get your notice of decision, or as they like to call it, the nod, which I learned the other day. They once they give you the nod, if they've told you, if they've sent that to you, or they've told you it's been issued, you don't need to wait for formal approval. You can actually get it. Right, moving on from this one. So what forms do you need to do? This is, I mean, it's all dependent on your situation, but you know, if you're buying a practice from an existing provider, or you've figured out that your registration is incorrect, then you probably need to deregister. So you generally do these at the same time. You'd fill out deregistration forms for a provider, for a manager. You do the registration forms for new provider, new manager. You submit those at the same time. There are other forms where in partnerships, if you take on a new partner, you can just add a partner. If you're adding a location, so if you're an existing provider and you're allowed as a provider to run dental practices and you've registered one location, and then you decide, I'm going to open another practice, you don't need to do a brand new provider registration. You do an add a location form and probably a registered manager application for that location. Change of director, if you're changing directors, that's actually a notification. So if two of your directors left, you've got two new directors. And the bottom one's an interesting one, which is a transfer form. So this is generally if there's an existing dental practice out there, I buy that dental practice, so I have to register as a new provider because I'm not an existing provider, but there is a manager in there who's been chupied over to my company, and she's already the registered manager. Then I can do a new provider application form, and I do a transfer form for that manager to transfer her over to my business because the CQC's already approved her. So figuring out what forms to do is a bit of a science and an art, but it's something that should hopefully give you an idea of the sort of things you need to think about. Who am I deregistering? Am I registering something new? Am I adding something to an existing registration, or am I taking something away? As a registered manager, you can also do an add a location to your form as well. So if you were in a limited company and they had 3 practices, and I was registered manager of one practice within that company, and another registered manager left that one, and I got asked, Alex, can you look after that practice as well? Then I can just do an add a location form to my registration. And at that point, if you're adding a location to a registered manager's registration, or if you're transferring a manager, you don't need a new DBS check. Okay, so I'll move on for now. The checking your registration is correct. So with all of this, some of you might be, but I don't know how my registration is. How am I supposed to know if it's correct or not? Really, really simple. You can go online on the CQC website, and in the box at the top there, either put the name of your practice, or, to be honest, the best thing to do is to put your practice postcode. So if Purely Orthodontics are a member of ours, I apologise for using you on these slides. It's literally just a search that I did yesterday to see what came up. So what we can see on this, so you can actually see on the website how you're registered. Do you have registered managers? What does it say about you? So if I move on from that, if you type that in, you then get a list. Now the list looks like what's on the left of this slide, where it says Purely Orthodontics. And you can see that I've found 3 Purely Orthodontics practices there. So these they're not showing providers here, they're showing practices. So what you can see on the left here is there are 3 practices called Purely Orthodontics. We can see that there are 3 locations. The top one we can see is provided by a limited company. We know that we're registered as a limited company. The middle one is provided by Mr. Kumar. So we know Mr. Kumar is registered as a sole trader for that site. The bottom one is provided by Purely Orthodontics. Now that's not a name, and it's not a limited company. It could be a limited company, so we might need to click to see a bit more. It's actually a partnership. Quite often you'll find that the partnerships are just the practice name. If you click on the actual location, so if we'd gone in, we'd typed purely orthodontics and we got a list like what's on the left there, if I click on the top one, right at the top where it says purely orthodontics, that's a hyperlink, that blue, the one that's provided by Harpenden Orthodontic Care Limited, what I get is what's on the right hand of this screen. I get that, but I go into that location and you can see I've got a tab that I can click, which is Overview, Inspection Summary Reports, and Registration Info. Under Overview, you actually get this little list, who runs this service. So I can see it's provided by a limited company, I can see who the registered managers are, I can see who the nominated individual is, and if I actually wanted to look at that even more, I could click on Registration Info. So that's how you can find out what you're registered as on the CQC. If for some reason you're not sure what type of business you are, you can always look on Companies House as well. You can see if you're registered on Companies House as a limited company. So that's how you check if your registration is correct, which might be the first step to fixing it. So, moving on, renting rooms. When you're renting rooms, so scenarios. Let's talk about these scenarios and see what people see. So scenario one, an existing provider. And I've been bad here because I've almost spoken about the provider as if they're a person. But let's say they're a sole trader. A sole trader is registered, so they're an existing provider. They have their own practice, but they also rent a room 2 days a week to see their patients in another practice. What do they need to do? Do they need to do anything? Officially, if you read the CQC's guidance, officially it will say add a location if they're an existing provider. Unofficially, the CQC will actually let you just have it on your statement of purpose. You don't need to register that location. That's unofficial, but this is something we've been told. If it's a couple of days a week, maybe 2 to 3 days a week, and you're an existing provider and they're happy with you, they'll generally just let you add that to your statement of purpose. So it's just a notification. So the second one, an existing provider rents a room full time to see patients of their business in another practice. Yes, add a location. So that would be another location under their existing provider registration. The third one is basically someone who is not registered as a provider, so they are just a hospital specialist on their own, and they rent a room 1 day a week from an existing provider. They need to register as a provider and register a location. If they are not an existing provider themselves as a sole trader, this doesn't work with limited companies, by the way, really. But if they're not an existing provider themselves as a sole trader, they need to register a provider and they need to register the location. I mean, that would be part of the application. So they need to register. This was happening, I don't know, in the last sort of 12 months, but before that, I saw this quite a lot with people registering rooms and not actually registering as providers. And sometimes like an associate who works 4 days a week in one practice, for a corporate might do 1 day a week private somewhere else, they need to register as a provider. Actions for registration. So, if you are in this scenario and you need to fix a registration, or if you're doing a new registration, here's some actions for you. Number one is don't panic, especially if you've found out that your registration is wrong. All the info is out there. And if you want help, either just a bit of advice on it, or if you want code to pretty much do your application for you or fix your registration for you, that is a service that we offer to our members. We don't do it for non-members. So obviously, your steps are figure out your existing registration. I've shown you how you can have a look at that. Decide on your business entity. You may already have an existing business entity, or if you're buying a new practice, you may want to speak to your accountant and say, what's the best way of doing this? As a sole trader, as a limited company, now that I'm getting a second practice and I'm already a sole trader, should I just incorporate and put them all under the limited company? So decide on your business entity, decide on your registered persons. Who's going to be your registered manager? That's really important because they're going to have to pass the interview. If you are a partner, then you're going to be interviewed. If you're a sole trader, then it's you. And decide who's going to be your nominated individual. And get all the documentation that you need to get for those people. Now this is a tricky one. Because I've put 5 and 6 are tricky to figure out which way round to do them, because do you want to get your DBS checks and then tell the CQC at the point you're ready to apply? Or do you want to tell the CQC, be honest with them, and then go and obtain the DBS checks? Obviously, option B, or the order that we've got on the sheet is better, to be honest with the CQC. And what I've found is if you're completely honest with the CQC, and it was an honest mistake, then they're generally quite nice with you. They will ring you up and probably interview you very quickly for 5-10 minutes, if you're fixing, just to figure out, whether or not it was because of dishonesty. But I've seen practices. I know one owner of a business who came over from abroad, worked on Harley Street, then bought a practice from an existing provider, and the provider said to him, "Oh, you don't need to worry about CQC registration. That's just like having a code membership or something like that." So he just didn't get registered. He was running an unregistered practice for about 12 months. So when he told the CQC, they were actually really, really good about it. They interviewed him quickly over the phone, understood it. So when you tell the CQC is up to you, I think the sooner probably the better. Identify which forms you need to complete. Deregister the existing provider if applicable, and/or managers. And at the same time, register the new provider, managers. So this is just submitting all the forms or doing it online on the provider portal, and sorting out any transfers of managers. And then making sure your compliance is perfect. Because if you're fixing your registration, there's most likely interviews are going to happen, and most likely that will happen on site. And at that point, they probably will want to have a look at your compliance as well. So you want to make sure you're compliant. You are absolutely on top of your compliance. I wouldn't hold off fixing your registration, because if you're knowingly running an unregistered service, you start hitting potential ethical issues. And if you decided, well, I want to catch up on my compliance, and at the point where you're doing that, the CQC find out, that might not go too well for you. So, and will you get inspected? We'll look at what happens later on a different slide. Right, so moving on. So reading for registration. So this is just a very, very quick one. If you are filling out the registration form, quite often people get a bit stuck when they hit what is called section 7 of the form. Now, section 7 of the form asks you to describe how you're going to run a safe, caring, effective, responsive, well-led practice, and gives you a massive box for each of them. So you need to be able to fill that form out. We have a briefing on CQC inspection in iComply, which is B195. So there's G106 as well, which is CQC registration. There is the briefing on CQC inspection. The code is important, but to be honest, if you have, I think Leanie's going to put it in there for me. I think if you have iComply, you can just type in briefing on CQC inspection. And we also have a downloadable guide on our website that talks about what they look for under the key line. Yes, it is B195. Good, I got it right. In all three of those documents, there are sections on the key lines of inquiry, and if you read those, you should be able to fill out that section. And to be honest, you want to read those, because if you're running a dental practice, you want to understand what the key. If you're a registered person, then you probably want to know what you're having to comply with, and to be able to demonstrate that to the CQC, which is what we're going to go into a second with the interview. So you need to be aware of why they are interviewing you. They're interviewing you because they want to check that you know what you're going to do and you understand it. So you need to be able to demonstrate, understand, and show them what the fundamental standards are. So when you're doing compliance, you're complying with multiple regulations, but at a core, what you're complying with is the Health and Social Care Act and the fundamental standards. So you need to know what they are. How can you ever run a compliant business if you don't know what the laws and the regulations say? It would be impossible. So you need to understand what a registered manager is. A registered manager is the person, or registered person, I should have said registered person, because sole traders and partners get this interview as well. These are the registered people are the ones who are, well, less so with partners, because they have to register managers as well. So registered managers and sole traders are legally responsible and accountable for making sure that the fundamental standards, the minimum level of compliance, is met at every part of every day. So they need to understand how much time you're going to have, how much time you're going to have, how much time you're going to give it, what your knowledge is, what your experience is, what your skills are. So if you go into that interview understanding that, and you prepare for the interview knowing that, then that's half the battle. if you know what they are looking for in you, then you'll be able to prepare effectively. And then obviously you need to nail the interview, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So, I just said this, the fundamental standards are the standards below which your care must never fall. This was a quote from the CQC from many years ago when they introduced the fundamental standards. And this document on the left is available on the CQC website. And if you're going to be interviewed to be a registered person, the first thing I say you should read is that document on the left. It's about 100 pages long, and you saw a snippet of it earlier, but that goes through all the regulations from the Health and Social Care Act and the CQC's interpretation of what they expect from you. So that is your number one document to start preparing for the interview. I've already covered this pretty much. But again, just registering that point that they're looking for necessary qualifications, competence and knowledge and experience. And you've got to demonstrate the competency required to actually manage the service, right? So if I'm moving on from that, these are the other things that you can read. So the first one I mentioned is for preparation. So the guidance for providers on meeting the regulations on the left is number one. The 2015 version of the Primary Care Dental Handbook, Provider Handbook, is very, very good. But make sure it's the March 2015 edition. The reason I'm mentioning that is because there's an appendix in it where they go through all the key lines of inquiry and examples of what they're looking for. So that gives you some context. And after you've read those two documents, but only after you've read those two documents, would I recommend reading the template answers. This is G107 in the iComply system, and this is basically our guide to the interview. So it goes through the sort of questions you will be asked, and it also covers the sort of questions you'll be asked, and it also covers the answers that you can give. So moving on, you can also look at webinars. If you go to codeuk.com/webinars, we have webinars on the key lines of inquiry. This webinar will be there eventually. That could be a really good way to prepare for an interview as well, after you've done all the recommended reading. So just a quick line on that on webinars. So during the interview, if you remember that, if you just bear in mind that what the CQC want to see is this person knows what compliance looks like. They know how to make a practice compliant. They know how to manage it. They are in charge of it, and they're not just going to delegate it away and have nothing to do with it. They're going to give it enough time. Then that's what you need to bear in mind. So you may not have the experience. I put experience at the top there because if you're a manager who's been doing this for 10 years, then you probably can just breeze that interview. So that's quite interesting. So if you can't say that you've got experience, you need to show that you've got skills and knowledge. Well, you need to show all three, but experience, a dentist can't show experience, generally speaking, when they get to this. And they're not talking about your dental experience. So one of the worst things you can say in this interview, which has happened on occasion, is talking about what postgraduate courses you've done as a dentist, you know, what clinical things you've done, because this whole application has nothing to do with clinical skills. Nothing to do with your clinical experience, and this is where people do slip up. So the experience is management experience, skills and knowledge. So if an associate dentist went to register with the CQC, or somebody from outside the dentistry came in, then, you know, if you've got a manager from outside the dentistry, they can talk about their managerial skills because they've been a manager and they know how to manage people, they know how to manage systems, they know how to manage to rules, they just maybe don't know the rules yet. And that's where your knowledge comes in, based on the reading and research you've done beforehand. And you can say, and you can admit it, you can say, during the interview, you can say to the inspector, I appreciate that you're going to be concerned that I don't have the experience of running a dental practice or managing compliance. I'm aware of that, so this is what I've done about it. I have worked with code. I've got iComply. I've had a code, I've had a consultant coach me on this. I've had, you can talk about, you've got to be able to cover that off. But if you can show that you understand where they're coming from and what you've done about it, and that you know the regulations well enough and you're going to manage them, then that's fine. Time. Basically speaking, the CQC expect a registered manager to be on site 2 to 3 days a week. That doesn't mean management, but you need to be there. If you're not going to be on site 2 to 3 days a week, don't try and register as a manager or as a registered person. It's not going to work. So that means that then for multiple sites, the CQC are generally happy with a registered manager managing 2 practices. 3, you would need to show that you've got management support below you. And that's where we get into delegation. So where you can quite easily mess up on the interview, especially if you're going in as a sole trader, is you can say, well, my manager's going to manage all of that for me. Oh, I don't need to know about that because my manager's going to do that. Because the CQC are going to turn around and go, well, we'll stop this right now. Your manager needs to be put forward as your registered manager, not you. So the way that you cover that off, is that you say to the CQC, well, I am going to be, I am of course going to be there 2 to 3 days a week. I have a full-time practice manager or whatever. We're going to spend 8 hours a week managing compliance. We're devoting 1 day a week to this. My manager will do the majority of the work, but we will have a weekly meeting. I'm aware that I can't delegate my legal accountability to my manager. I'm accountable. She's going to be responsible, and we're going to have a weekly meeting where we catch up and we discuss issues, and I'm going to manage her on compliance. So time and delegation is really important, and it's easy to slip up if you are basically saying, I don't need to have this knowledge, I don't need to have this, because you're applying for a position in law that says that you need to have it. At the end of the day, as a business owner, how do you know? If you don't understand, this is similar to the last webinar that's going to go up on YouTube very, very shortly, but if you recruit a manager and you don't know what they're supposed to be managing, how can you ever make sure that they're doing their job properly? So if you are a principal and you have a practice manager and you don't know what the regulations are or what compliance is about, they could just be pulling the wool over your eyes. As a practice owner, it is part of your job, unfortunately, to manage your manager, because they are your number one and they're below you. So you need to manage them. So moving on from all of this, so delegation and scenarios, they're going to go through duty of candor scenarios, things like that, which, having done all of your reading and your background work, you will be able to do that. Okay, so will you get inspected or interviewed? So the general rules around this is all new locations are inspected once. The CQC need to look in your building. Any building that provides dentistry needs to be inspected before they will allow patients to walk in there. So that's new locations, brand new practices. All new registered persons need to be interviewed to pass the interview that we were just discussing, to be registered, essentially. If you're changing from a sole trader / partner to a registered manager and vice versa, so if I've been a sole trader, Alex O'Neill Dentistry, and I then I start a limited company, and I need to deregister my sole trader business, register my limited company, and we're a small practice, so I want to be the registered manager. Technically speaking, yes, I have to be interviewed again. Because you can't carry over the interview that I had as a sole trader cannot be carried over to a registered manager interview. The processes and the legalities mean I need to be interviewed again. However, it's risk dependent. So where and how tough that is. So it might be over the phone, or it might be in the practice. If I've failed an inspection previously, they might come to the practice to interview me again, or they might do it over the phone. If they're really concerned and they want to deny me, I'll probably be invited to the CQC office, or they might turn up in suits, or there might be 2 of them, or something like that. So what you sometimes see is the CQC dress appropriately or pick the format or whatever, depending on the risk and the message that they need to give. So if purchasing a location from an existing provider, so if I'm buying my first dental practice from somebody else, generally speaking, the inspection, there won't be an inspection. They will inspect you after 1 year, because they're giving you time to find your feet in the practice. And if they inspect you on day 1 and the old principal was terrible at compliance, then it's going to be a mess, and it's not really your fault because you weren't legally allowed to set foot in the practice until you've completed on it. So they'll generally give you 1 year. If changing your registration, then it's dependent on risk. So if I'm changing from a sole trader to a limited company and I failed my last inspection, then they may decide to come and do an interview and an inspection, on a little mini inspection on site. If I'm fixing my registration, then it's likely they're going to come and interview and inspect on site and do an informal inspection. So I will move on from this slide. So actions for registration. I'm not going to go through them again. I went through them earlier. So there are your actions for registration. So you might want to check your compliance and deal with it. It's the same list that was there earlier. So registration consultancy. Now, if you do want some help with this, I generally say to people, try yourself first, because, if you're a registered manager, if you're managing regulations, if you are, if you're a sole trader and you're wanting to do this, or you're running this business, it might be a good learning process for you to actually, learn the regulations, go back. It might help you a lot. You might want to have a crack at doing the forms. But if you don't want to, if you want codes help, then what I can tell you is that solicitors generally charge about £1,500 plus VAT to do this registration. And generally speaking, the solicitors aren't experts in doing this. We normally charge $749 plus VAT per day to fix registrations or do new registrations, and it generally 99.9% of registrations just take 1 day. Sometimes, if we're doing a complex partnership with 8 partners, it might be 2 to 3 days. But if you are interested and you want some help from us, if you call 01409 254 419, press that option 1, that's going to put you through to our new business team. You can have a chat with them.